The letter arrived on a Tuesday, smelling of dust and horse sweat, and Clara Townsend read it twice before she let herself believe that Aaron Carver had actually found her. The year was 1878, and Redemption Creek, Texas, was the kind of town that swallowed people whole. It was not a place where anyone came looking for something they had lost. It was a place where people came to forget, to disappear, to let the dry wind scour away whatever life they had lived before. The saloon never closed. The sheriff was half blind and fully drunk by noon, and the cemetery on the East Hill grew faster than the town itself. Clara had chosen it precisely because it was the last place anyone would think to look for a woman like her. She had been in Redemption Creek for 8 months when the letter came. 8 months working at the Dawson boarding house, washing linens and scrubbing floors and cooking meals for miners and drifters and gamblers who passed through without ever really seeing her. She kept her hair pinned tight and her eyes down and her voice quiet, and she had become, in that time, very nearly invisible. That was the point. That had always been the point. She folded the letter and pressed it flat against the rough wooden table in the room she rented above the laundry, and she read it again. The handwriting was Aaron's. She would have known it anywhere, those careful, deliberate letters that he had taught himself in a one-room schoolhouse outside of Abilene when he was 12 years old, the same schoolhouse where they had first sat across from each other and thought nothing of it and then thought everything of it in the years that followed. He wrote the way he spoke, directly, without waste. "Clara," it said, "I know where you are. I am coming. I need you to hear what I have to say before you decide anything. Give me that much, just that much, Aaron." She set the letter down and walked to the window and looked out at the main street of Redemption Creek, where a pair of cowboys were riding in from the south, and a woman was beating a rug against the side of a building, and a dog was sleeping in the doorway of the general store, as if the whole world could fall apart around it, and it would simply go on sleeping. The afternoon light was the color of old brass. The wind moved through the street in slow, indifferent waves. Clara pressed her hand against the glass. She was 26 years old and she felt 80. She thought about Aaron Carver and the last time she had seen him, which had been a year ago in Abilene, standing in the yard of the house she had shared with her late husband, looking at her with those dark, steady eyes that never gave anything away until they gave everything away all at once. She had told him to leave. She had told him there was nothing between them. She had told him she was not the woman he thought she was, and she had told him it so convincingly that she had almost believed it herself. But she had not been able to stop seeing his face in the year that followed, and she had not been able to stop wondering whether she had done the right thing or the cowardice thing, and she suspected that those two things were not as different as she had always told herself they were. She put the letter in the tin box under her bed where she kept the few things she owned that mattered. Then she went downstairs and finished her work for the day, and she did not sleep much that night. Aaron Carver rode into Redemption Creek on a Friday afternoon in late October, which was perhaps the most fitting time of year for a man to arrive in a dying town looking for a woman who did not want to be found. The sky was the kind of pale gray that made everything look washed out and temporary, and the wind had a bite to it that hadn't been there a week before. He rode a dark bay gelding named Bishop, who was 12 years old and had carried Aaron across 3 states and never once complained, and he rode the way he always did, with that particular combination of ease and alertness that came from spending more of his life on horseback than off. He was 28 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who worked the land got weathered, not beaten down but shaped by it, the way a piece of good wood got shaped by a careful hand. He had a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 4 days, and a coat that had seen better years, and a pair of eyes the color of creek water in October that had a habit of noticing everything before he said a word about any of it. He had ridden almost 200 miles in 5 days to get here. He did not think that was excessive. He tied Bishop at the hitching post outside the only hotel in Redemption Creek, which was called the Grand Imperial Hotel, and was neither grand nor imperial, being a 2-story building with a sagging porch, and a sign that had lost its G somewhere along the way, so it read Rand Imperial Hotel in faded paint. He gave the gelding a long drink from the trough and a handful of grain from his saddlebag, and then he stood on the porch steps and looked down the length of the main street and thought about where a woman like Clara Townsend would go when she wanted to be forgotten. He had asked around before he came. He was not the sort of man who rode 200 miles on a guess. He had talked to people in Abilene who knew people in Fort Worth who knew people in Sweetwater, and eventually someone had mentioned a boarding house in Redemption Creek run by a widow named Dawson, and that was all he had needed. He found the boarding house without difficulty. It was on the south end of the main street, a long, low building with a vegetable garden on the side that was mostly dead now with winter coming, and a porch where a pair of old men sat playing cards in the cold like they had nowhere better to be. He knocked on the front door and a large, practical-looking woman in her 50s opened it and looked at him the way practical women looked at strangers, which was with the specific kind of suspicion that came from experience. "Help you," she said. "I am looking for a woman by the name of Clara Townsend," Aaron said. "I was told she works here." The woman looked at him for a long time without speaking. "Who's asking?" "My name is Aaron Carver." "I am an old friend. I wrote to her about coming." Something shifted in the woman's expression, not softening exactly, but rearranging. "She did say someone might come. She did not say she wanted to see you." "No," Aaron said. "She did not say that, but she did not say she did not want to see me either, and in my experience that is the gap where things get decided." The woman studied him another moment and then said, "I am Margaret Dawson. Clara is in the laundry room, through the back." She stepped aside. "You cause any trouble, I have a shotgun and I know how to use it." "Yes, ma'am," Aaron said, and he meant it respectfully. He found Clara in the laundry room, which was a hot, damp space at the back of the house that smelled of lye soap and steam. She was lifting a heavy sheet out of a wooden wash tub and wringing it with her hands, and she had her back to the door. And for a moment he just stood there and looked at her, and felt the particular sharp ache of seeing someone you have thought about every day for a year suddenly become real and present again. She was wearing a gray dress that was too big for her, and her dark hair was pinned up loosely with strands coming loose around her face, and she looked thinner than he remembered and more tired and impossibly more herself, which was the thing about Clara that had always gotten him. She was entirely herself in a way that most people were not. Even trying to disappear, she was more present than anyone else in the room. She must have sensed him because she went still before she turned around. When she turned, her face did the thing he had seen it do before, the thing where she shut everything down behind her eyes like windows being closed against a coming storm. But he had known her long enough to see what happened in the split second before the shutters closed, which was that she looked at him with something raw and undone and real. "Aaron," she said, her voice was steady. "Clara," he said, "you should not have come. You got the letter." "I got the letter." She turned back to the wash tub and went back to wringing the sheet. "I hoped you would think better of it." "I thought about it plenty," he said. "I thought about it for about 200 miles and I did not think better of it." She wrung the sheet without saying anything. Steam rose off the water in the tub. Through the small high window above the door, the gray October sky pressed down like a lid. "I'm not who you think I am," she said finally. "You have told me that before, because it is still true." "What does that mean, Clara?" "That you have done things you are not proud of. So have I, that you have made mistakes. Every person who has ever drawn breath has made mistakes. That you are carrying something you think makes you less than what a person ought to be. I would like to hear what it is before I agree with you." She set the sheet down and turned to face him. Her eyes were bright, not with tears but with something harder and more complicated. "You rode 200 miles. Yes. Because of a letter you sent yourself. Because I was not finished saying what I needed to say to you in Abilene. I was finished hearing it." "I know you were," he said. "I am asking you to let me have one more conversation with you, just one. And after that, if you want me to ride back the same direction I came from, I will do it, but I need you to hear me first." She looked at him for a long time. The steam curled between them like something alive. "I finish here at 6, she said at last. "There is a bench out behind the building by the garden. You can talk to me there." "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me yet," she said, and turned back to her work. He went back out into the cold afternoon and found a place to stable Bishop, and paid for a room at the Rand Imperial Hotel, and then sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his hands and thought about what he wanted to say. He had been thinking about it for 200 miles, and he still was not sure he had the right words. But then again, Aaron Carver had never been a man who trusted words alone. He trusted showing up. He trusted staying. He trusted the kind of thing that could not be argued with, which was simply presence, the simple, undeniable fact of being there when you said you would be. He had a bath at the hotel and ate a meal at the saloon that was mostly beans and not much else, and he watched the people of Redemption Creek go about the business of their afternoon without involving him, and he thought that Clara had chosen well in terms of obscurity, if not in terms of quality of life. At 5 minutes to 6, he was sitting on the bench behind the Dawson boarding house, with the dead vegetable garden spreading out brown and frostbitten before him, and the sky overhead going the deep cold purple of early evening. He could hear music coming from the saloon 2 streets over, a fiddle and something else he could not quite identify, and somewhere a dog was barking, with the particular exhausted rhythm of a dog that had been barking for a long time, and had forgotten what it was barking at. Clara came out at exactly 6 o'clock. She had taken down her hair and put on a heavier shawl, and her face was tired but composed, and she sat down on the other end of the bench with a careful foot of space between them and folded her hands in her lap and looked out at the dead garden. "All right," she said. "Talk." He looked at the garden too. It was easier, he had found, to say the hard things when you were looking at something else. "When your husband died," he said, "I waited. I waited because it was the right thing to do, and because I respected that you were grieving, even though I also knew that your marriage had not been a happy one, and I am not saying that to be cruel. It is just what I knew. I waited 6 months, and then I came to see you, and I told you that I had carried feelings for you for a long time, and I asked if I might court you proper. And you told me no, and you told me to leave, and you told me some things about yourself that were meant to make me think less of you, and I left because you asked me to." He paused. "But those things you told me," he said, "I have been turning them over in my mind for a year, and I want you to know that none of them changed anything." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You do not know everything. Then tell me." She turned and looked at him sharply. "I am not confessing my history to you, Aaron. I am not asking for a confession. I am asking you to let me decide for myself what I can live with and what I cannot, instead of deciding for me." "That is a charming way to say it," she said. "But you are a good man. You have always been a good man. You have a reputation and a life, and I have a piece of land outside Abilene," he said. "I have a house I built myself that is too big for one person. I have a horse that is getting old and a pair of dogs and about 40 head of cattle. That is what I have, and none of it means what it ought to mean without someone to come home to." Clara looked away. He could see the line of her jaw go tight. "You deserve better than someone who is running from her own name," she said very quietly. "Maybe," he said, "but I do not want better, I want you." The fiddle from the saloon floated over the rooftops in the cold evening air. Somewhere in the dead garden, a cricket was still alive and still singing, which seemed to Aaron like a kind of stubborn courage. "I am not worth the ride you made," Clara said. He let the words sit between them for a moment, the way you let a stone settle before you try to move it. "I have already made the ride," he said, "and I am not leaving without your answer." She turned and looked at him then, really looked at him, with all the shutters open and no defenses up, and he saw in her face something that he recognized because it was the same thing he felt when he looked at her, which was the terrifying, inconvenient, enormous relief of being seen. Her eyes were the color of amber when the light went through it, and they were full of things she had not said. "I have made a mess of things," she said. "So have I. My mess is different. Tell me." She looked back at the garden for a long time. The cold was coming down in earnest now, and her breath made small white clouds in the air. "My husband, Robert," she said at last. "When he died, people assumed it was the cholera because half the county was dying of cholera that summer, and I let them assume it. I did not correct them. Because the truth was that Robert and I had a terrible fight, a worse one than we had ever had before, and I threw a pitcher at him, and he stumbled and fell and hit his head on the stone of the fireplace. And I went to get help as fast as I could, but by the time the doctor came, Robert was already gone." Her voice was level. She had told this to herself so many times that the words came out smooth and uninflected. "The doctor said it was the cholera," she said. "He had cholera symptoms. He had been sick before the fall. The doctor said the fall was incidental, that he would have died anyway. But I have never been certain whether that is true or whether it is something the doctor said to spare a widow. And I do not know, Aaron. I have never known for certain whether what happened was an accident or whether it was my fault. And that is what I carry." He was quiet. The cricket in the dead garden kept singing. "That is why you ran," he said. "I could not stay in Abilene. Everyone was kind to me, and I could not bear their kindness because I felt I did not deserve it. Clara," he said, "the doctor said he would have died anyway. I know what the doctor said. And you were defending yourself in that fight. Robert had a temper. Everyone in Abilene knew Robert had a temper." Her hands tightened in her lap. "That does not excuse. It was an accident," he said. "Even if the fall had been the cause, which the doctor said it was not, it would have been an accident in a moment of fear. You are not a murderer. You are a woman who survived a hard marriage and has spent a year punishing herself for surviving it." She was very still. "You do not think less of me," she said. "It was not quite a question. I think you have been carrying something that would have broken most people," he said. "And you are still here and still standing and still fighting. No, I do not think less of you." She put her face in her hands for a moment, and he did not reach for her. He just sat beside her in the cold and let her feel whatever she needed to feel. When she lifted her face again, her eyes were wet, but she was not crying, or she was no longer crying, and she looked at him with that open, undefended look again. "You are the most stubborn man I have ever met," she said. "I prefer determined," he said. "Of course you do." They sat there in the cold evening for a while longer, not saying anything, and the cricket kept singing. "I do not know how to go back," she said eventually, "to Abilene, to a life that people know." "We do not have to go back," he said. "I would sell the land if you wanted, start somewhere else. I am not attached to a piece of ground. I am attached to you." She looked at him. "You would sell your land?" In a breath. She shook her head slowly, but it was not a no. It was the head shake of someone trying to understand something that kept not fitting into the category they had built for it. "Give me some time," she said. "I have been in this town for 8 months, and I have not let myself think about anything beyond the next week. I need to think." "I will stay," he said. "You cannot stay at the boarding house. Mrs. Dawson does not allow male boarders." "I am at the hotel down the street," he said. "I will be there. Take the time you need." She looked at him one more time with those amber eyes, and then she stood and wrapped her shawl tighter and said, "Good night, Aaron," and went inside. He sat on the bench until the cold drove him to his feet, and then he walked back through the quiet streets of Redemption Creek toward the hotel with the missing letter, and thought that things were not resolved, but they were moving, the way a river moved under ice in winter, invisibly and with tremendous force. The next morning, Aaron woke to the sound of a commotion in the street below his window. He pulled on his boots and looked out to see 3 men on horseback at the far end of the main street, talking loudly with a group of townspeople. One of the men was doing most of the talking, a big man with a wide dark hat and the kind of carrying voice that was used to making itself heard over distances. Aaron went downstairs and out into the street. It turned out that the 3 men were ranch hands from a spread called the Bar 7, owned by a man named Claude Hicks, who owned most of the land east of Redemption Creek, and who had, according to the conversation Aaron was hearing, made an offer on the Dawson property. Mrs. Dawson had declined. Claude Hicks had now sent these men to let her know that declining was not truly an option, because Claude Hicks did not often hear the word no, and had not developed a graceful relationship with it. The big man with the wide hat was speaking to Mrs. Dawson, who had come out onto her porch and was standing with her arms folded, and she looked about as movable as a stone wall. She was telling him in flat, clear terms that her property was not for sale and that he and his friends were welcome to ride back to wherever they had come from. The big man was telling her that she was going to reconsider. Aaron walked up to the edge of this exchange and stood. "Is there a problem here?" he said. The big man looked at him. "None of your concern, friend." "I am staying at the boarding house," Aaron said, which was not technically true but was not a lie that needed to be corrected at this particular moment, "which makes it my concern." "I do not know who you are," the big man said. "Aaron Carver," Aaron said, "and Mrs. Dawson has told you her property is not for sale. I do not see that there is anything left to discuss." The big man and his two companions looked at Aaron in the way that men calculated things, and Aaron stood the way a man stands when he is not afraid of what he is looking at, which is a specific way that communicates itself without words. The colt at his hip was not new and was not polished and looked like it had been used for purposes other than appearance, which it had. The big man after a moment seemed to arrive at the conclusion that this was a matter to bring back to Claude Hicks rather than to resolve on the street, and he wheeled his horse, and the three of them rode away in a direction that communicated their displeasure without constituting a direct threat. Mrs. Dawson came down off her porch and looked at Aaron. "Thank you," she said. "It is not over," Aaron said. "Men like Claude Hicks do not give up after one conversation. You may want to look at what legal protections you have on this property. Deed that is properly registered is a lot harder to argue with than a handshake." "I have a deed," she said. "My husband recorded it himself, God rest him." "Good, I would keep it somewhere safe." She looked at him steadily. "You are here for Clara." "Yes, ma'am. She is a good woman," she said. "Better than she thinks. She works harder than anyone I have ever employed, and she never complains, and she looks after the other boarders like they were her own people." She paused. "She is also terrified." "I know. Whatever happened in Abilene, she carries it heavy." "I know that too." Mrs. Dawson looked him up and down one more time with her practical eyes. "You staying through winter?" "If she will let me," Aaron said. Mrs. Dawson nodded and went back inside. Clara had come to the door during the exchange with the ranch hands and had seen it, though she had not come out. When Aaron came up the porch steps, she was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. "That will come back," she said. "It probably will, but it did not come back today." She looked at him. "You did not have to do that." "I know." She moved slightly in the doorway, which was not quite an invitation but was not a closed door. "Mrs. Dawson is going to make coffee," she said. "If you want some." "I would be glad of some," he said. The kitchen of the boarding house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee grounds and something baking, and it was the most comfortable Aaron had felt since he had left Abilene. He sat at the long kitchen table, and Mrs. Dawson poured coffee, and Clara sat across from him with both hands wrapped around her cup, and they talked about ordinary things, about the town and the weather and the business of the boarding house. And under those ordinary things something else was running, quiet and continuous, like that river under the ice. He began to spend his days in a particular rhythm that felt both purposeful and suspended, the way the days feel when you are waiting for something to shift. He would stable Bishop in the morning and then find small ways to be useful, fixing the loose board on the Dawson porch, helping the old men with their firewood, occasionally making himself visible on the street in a way that communicated to the bar 7 riders, when they came back as he knew they would, that there was a man here who was not going to look away. He and Clara began to talk in the evenings. Sometimes on the bench behind the garden, and sometimes in the kitchen, and sometimes on the front porch in the last light of the afternoon with their coffee. They talked the way people talk when they have known each other a long time, and are only now, finally, saying the things they should have said years ago. She told him about her childhood in San Marcos, about her father who had been a school teacher and her mother who had been the best seamstress in the county, and who had died of fever when Clara was 14. She told him about how she had married Robert Townsend at 19 because she was alone in the world and he had seemed solid and dependable, and how she had learned over the years that there was a difference between solid and immovable, and that Robert had been the second kind. Not violent, not cruel in obvious ways, but rigid and cold in a way that wore a person down slowly, the way water wore down stone. Aaron told her about growing up in Abilene, about his father who had been a decent man but a silent one, about learning to ride and work cattle, and do the 1,000 practical things that a man needed to know out here, and about the piece of land he had bought at 23 with every dollar he had ever saved, and the house he had built with his own hands over the course of 2 summers, and how he had built it big because he had always imagined it full of people and life, and how the echo of empty rooms was a particular kind of lonely that he had gotten very tired of. One afternoon, about 10 days after his arrival, he found Clara in the kitchen making a pie. She was rolling the crust with a practiced ease, her sleeves pushed up in flour on her forearms, and she was humming something low and tuneless under her breath, and she looked, Aaron thought, like a woman who had briefly forgotten to be afraid. He leaned against the door frame and watched without speaking, not wanting to interrupt whatever this was. She looked up and caught him watching, and for a moment just looked back at him without covering her face, and then she said, "The apples are from Mrs. Dawson's cellar. There are not many left." "It smells good already," he said. "It will taste better," she said, and went back to rolling, and that small, confident claim was the most like herself he had heard her be. He came in and poured himself coffee and sat at the table, and she went on making the pie, and they talked about nothing in particular, about whether the winter was going to be hard, and about a horse he had seen tied up at the general store that morning that had a particular gait he admired, and she told him she had always wanted to learn to ride properly, that she had never had the chance as a child and Robert had not been interested in teaching her. Aaron said he would teach her. She said she did not want to put him out. He said it would not put him out in the slightest. She looked at him across the table with a small, careful smile that was not quite an answer and not quite a refusal, and he took it for what it was, which was a door opening a crack. The Bar 7 men came back the following week, on a gray Wednesday morning, and this time there were 5 of them. The big man was there again, and with him 4 others, one of whom got down off his horse and walked up to Mrs. Dawson's door with a folded paper that turned out to be a legal document of some kind, which Aaron later learned was a dubious claim that Claude Hicks had registered with a sympathetic clerk in the county seat, asserting some kind of prior water right that had implications for the Dawson property's value. Aaron had been watching from across the street, and he came over and read the paper, and said that the claim was legal in form but almost certainly not legal in substance, and that Mrs. Dawson needed to ride to the county seat herself and speak to the land office directly and not rely on any representations from Claude Hicks's people. "I cannot go myself," Mrs. Dawson said. "I have a house full of boarders and no one to manage it." "I will manage it," Clara said. Both Aaron and Mrs. Dawson looked at her. She straightened her spine. "I have been doing most of the managing anyway. You should go. I will take care of things here." Mrs. Dawson looked at Aaron. Aaron nodded slightly. Mrs. Dawson looked back at Clara and said, "All right." The Bar 7 man who had delivered the paper was still standing on the porch, looking at this exchange with the particular patience of a man who expected compliance and was willing to wait for it. "This is not settled," he told Aaron. "No," Aaron agreed. "But it is also not urgent. Mrs. Dawson will handle this through proper channels, and I suggest you inform Claude Hicks of that." The man looked at him for a long moment and then walked back to his horse. It took Mrs. Dawson 3 days to make the round trip to the county seat, and in those 3 days, Clara ran the boarding house and Aaron spent most of his time there helping where he could and also where he wanted to be, which was the same place. They fell into a comfortable industry together, a shared language of tasks and small decisions, and the particular ease of two people who fit in a space together. He fixed a window that had been letting cold air in. She cooked 3 meals a day for 8 boarders, including 2 minors and a schoolteacher passing through, and an old man named Fletcher who had been at the boarding house so long that he had become part of the furniture. Aaron ate at the long table with everyone else and became, in those 3 days, simply a part of the household. On the second evening, after the dishes were done and the boarders had retired, he and Clara sat in the kitchen with the wood stove going and the night pressing against the windows, and she said, without particular preamble, "Do you think I could actually go back?" He did not pretend not to know what she meant. To Abilene, or anywhere that is not here. Anywhere with a name that people know. She was looking at the table. "I have been afraid of being recognized, afraid that someone will know what happened with Robert and will think what I think about it, the worst of it." "Clara," he said gently, "what does the doctor's word mean if not that you were innocent of what you fear? A doctor's word is not a judge's word. There was no inquest, there was no accusation, there was nothing but a death that was ruled natural causes." He leaned forward. "What you are afraid of is not the law finding you. What you are afraid of is yourself." She looked up at him. The wood stove ticked and popped. Outside, the wind had come up and was working at the eaves. "I think you might be right," she said quietly. "The woman who threw that pitcher," he said, "was a woman who had been worn down for years and who finally broke for a moment. That is not a crime. That is not even a moral failing. That is being human." "You are very certain," she said. "I am very certain about you," he said. "I have been certain about you since we were 16 years old, sitting across from each other in a one-room schoolhouse, and you answered every question before I had a chance to think of the answer. And I was annoyed with you for about a week, and then I decided you were the most interesting person I had ever met." She laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of her, and it changed her face completely. He had not heard her laugh before, and it was better than anything he had imagined. Warm and unguarded and full of the person she actually was underneath all the careful management. "I remember that," she said. "I remember thinking you were very proud." "I was absolutely very proud," he said. "I was 12 and you were smarter than me, and I had a great deal of difficulty accepting that. And now I have entirely accepted it and moved on." She smiled at him, and this smile was different from the careful small ones she had been allowing herself. This one reached her eyes. "Aaron," she said. "I want to try, I want to." She stopped and started again. "I am frightened, but I want to try." He did not reach across the table immediately. He let the words settle. "What does trying look like to you?" "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "Something more than this, something with more of a future in it. I do not know if it is Abilene or somewhere else, but I know it should not be Redemption Creek. I have been hiding here, and hiding is not living." "No," he said, "it is not." She looked at their hands on the table, separated by a foot of old pine. "When Mrs. Dawson gets back," she said carefully, would you walk with me? Just walk and talk. See if we can be what we were in Abilene before I got afraid." "I would walk with you anywhere," he said. "We can start as small as you need." She looked at him with those open amber eyes and said, "Thank you for coming, for making the ride." "Did you ever really doubt that I would?" She considered this seriously. "No," she said at last. "I do not think I did. I think I was terrified that you would and terrified that you would not, and when the letter came I did not know whether I felt relief or dread." "And now," she looked at him. "I feel relief," she said. "I feel relief and something else. Something that is much bigger than I have been letting myself feel things." He reached across the table and set his hand, palm up, on the pine between them, and she looked at it for a long moment, and then she put her hand in his, and neither of them said anything, and the wood stove popped, and the wind worked at the windows, and the night went on. Mrs. Dawson returned on Friday morning with documentation from the land office that confirmed her deed as valid and primary, and made the Hicks water claim effectively unenforceable, and she was pleased in a grim, satisfied way, and Aaron was quietly glad for her. That afternoon, as promised, he and Clara walked. They walked south out of the main street, and along the dry bed of the creek that had presumably once given the town its name, and was now just a wide stretch of pale sand with tracks in it, coyote and jackrabbit and the occasional boot print. The sky was clear and cold and very blue, the kind of blue that only Texas got in late October, deep and absolute. Bishop was stabled and contented, and Aaron was on foot beside Clara, and they walked close enough that their arms sometimes brushed when the path narrowed. And they talked, and they were quiet in comfortable intervals, and it was, Aaron thought, the best afternoon he had had in a long time. Clara told him she had been thinking about what came after Redemption Creek. She thought she would like to go somewhere new, not Abilene, but somewhere with good land and a decent town, somewhere with a school because she thought she might like to teach. She had always liked teaching, and her father had taught her enough that she thought she could pass a basic examination. Aaron listened to this with a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "There is land opening up around Laredo," he said, "and around Fredericksburg. Good soil, reliable water, towns that are growing. A school in a growing town is a needed thing." "You have been thinking about this," she said. "I have been thinking about the future," he said, "specifically a future that has you in it." She was quiet for a few steps. "That is a very direct thing to say. I am a direct person." "I know you are." Another few steps. "I am not. I want to be certain before I promise anything. I have made promises I could not keep before, and I do not want to do that again." "I am not asking for promises," he said. "I am asking for the chance to earn them." She stopped walking and turned to look at him, and the afternoon light fell across her face and made her beautiful in the particular way that the light in that country made everything beautiful, starkly and without pretense. "You have already earned more than you know," she said. He did not kiss her then, though he wanted to. She was still building the trust in herself that she needed. He could see that, and he was patient. He was, he thought, a very patient man, which had never seemed like a virtue until he met Clara Townsend, and understood that some things required the long approach. He offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked back through the fading afternoon, and it felt like a beginning. November came down on Redemption Creek like a gray blanket, cold and low and heavy. The miners began to thin out as the diggings further south became the better option in winter, and the boarding house quieted down to its handful of permanent residents. Clara found herself thinking, for the first time in months, about the future in concrete terms rather than as a vague fog of possibility. She thought about Fredericksburg. She had never been there, but she had heard it was beautiful, settled in part by German immigrants who had built it with the particular care of people who had come a long way and intended to stay. She thought about a school. She thought about a house that was not a rented room above a laundry. She thought about Aaron. She thought about Aaron a great deal, which was both new and not new at all, because she had been thinking about Aaron in one form or another for a very long time, but she had been thinking about him as something impossible, something she was not entitled to, and now she was allowing herself to think about him as something real. He was unlike Robert in every way that mattered. Where Robert had been rigid, Aaron was flexible. Where Robert had been cold, Aaron was warm in a contained, specific way that was never performance. Where Robert had filled a room with the pressure of his own certainty about how things should be, Aaron made a room feel larger by being in it, somehow creating the sense that whatever you were doing there, you had enough space to be entirely yourself. She had not understood, until Aaron, how much of herself she had compressed to fit the shape Robert had wanted her to be. One evening in the third week of November, Aaron came by the boarding house with something wrapped in brown paper that he set on the kitchen table with the careful deliberateness of a man doing something meaningful. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it," he said. She unwrapped the brown paper and found a book. It was not a new book. It was worn at the spine and the cover was soft with handling, but it was a primer, a basic schoolroom primer, the kind used to teach reading and arithmetic. "There was a man moving on from town today," Aaron said. "He had this in his wagon and I asked if he would sell it. He wanted 2 bits for it." She looked at the primer and then at him. For the school, she said, for when you have won. She held the book with both hands and felt something rise in her chest that was large and warm and not entirely safe, meaning it was the kind of feeling that once felt could not be unfelt. Aaron, she said, you do not have to say anything, he said. It is just a book. It is not just a book and you know it. He looked at her, and that look, that Creekwater October look, steady and deep and entirely without armor. No, he said. It is not just a book. She set the book on the table and crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him and looked up at him, and he stood very still and looked back at her. I think I am ready, she said. For what? He said very quietly, as if he needed to hear her say it. For this, she said. For you, for trying in earnest. He reached up and very gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and his hand lingered for a moment at the side of her face, and she turned her face slightly into his palm like something instinctive and unconscious, and he made a low sound that was not quite words. Clara, he said. Yes, she said. He kissed her then, finally, and it was not the rushed and desperate kind of kiss, but the kind that started slow and careful, and then deepened into something that had been building for a long time, and that, once released, had a great deal to say. She had forgotten, or perhaps had never known, that a kiss could feel like coming home. When they drew back, she had both hands flat against his chest and could feel his heartbeat, which was not as steady as it looked from the outside. I should have come for you sooner, he said. You came exactly when I was ready, she said. A week earlier and I would have sent you away and meant it. December came in cold and clear, and Aaron Carver was a permanent fixture of the Dawson boarding house in everything but the registry. He slept at the hotel, but he spent his days at the boarding house, and everyone in Redemption Creek who paid attention knew what was happening, and most of them seemed to approve, or at least to not disapprove, which in a small western town amounted to more or less the same thing. The question of Claude Hicks had not entirely resolved itself. His ranch hands had stopped coming directly to the Dawson property, but there were small things: a fence post pulled up on the south edge of the property, a water trough that was found one morning fouled with something that should not have been in it. Aaron fixed the fence post and cleaned the trough and said nothing, but his jaw was very tight when he did these things, and Clara watched him and understood that there was something he was not saying. He is not going to stop, she said one morning. No, Aaron agreed. What are you thinking? I am thinking that the legal route is the right route, and that Mrs. Dawson's deed is solid, and that patience is going to serve her better than confrontation. He paused. I am also thinking that Claude Hicks is used to small towns where no one pushes back, and that sometimes the most effective thing you can do is make it clear that this particular situation is not going to resolve in his favor no matter what he tries. Men like that are often more efficient than principled. If the cost becomes higher than the reward, they move on to the next target. And you make the cost higher by being here, she said. That is part of it. She looked at him. You are staying because of me and because of this, she said, and this is not even your fight. Your fight is my fight, he said simply. That is what it means. She did not know how to answer that, so she put her hand in his, and they stood together at the kitchen window looking out at the cold, bright December morning, and the words he had said settled into her, and she let them settle. The week before Christmas, Aaron went to see Claude Hicks directly. He rode out to the Bar 7 Ranch on a clear, cold morning, and was met at the gate by 2 armed hands who did not look welcoming, but let him through when he stated his name and his purpose. The house was large by local standards, built of stone with a wide porch, and Hicks himself met him there, a man of about 50 with the leathery self-possession of someone who had spent a long time being the largest presence in a room. They talked for an hour. Aaron was later reticent about the details of the conversation, but when he rode back to Redemption Creek and Clara asked him what had happened, he said that Claude Hicks was a businessman first and a bully second, and that once it was clearly communicated that Mrs. Dawson had documentation, legal representation through a contact Aaron had in the county seat, and a man on the property who was not going to be intimidated, the business calculation had shifted. They had reached a mutual understanding that the Dawson property was not of interest to anyone and that things would remain quiet. Clara looked at him for a long time. He just agreed to that. He agreed to find other opportunities, Aaron said. Which is about as much as you can ask from a man like that. What did you say to him? Aaron almost smiled. I was very polite, he said. She raised an eyebrow and he said, I was. I simply also made certain he understood what the alternative looked like. Aaron. It is handled, Clara. She will not have more trouble from him. Mrs. Dawson, when told, sat in her kitchen and looked at the table for a moment and then said, well. She poured 3 cups of coffee and they all sat together and said very little, but the kitchen felt lighter than it had since the summer. Christmas in Redemption Creek was a modest affair, the church holding a service and the saloon doing extra business and the main street strung with a few lanterns. Mrs. Dawson cooked a large meal and everyone in the boarding house ate together. The miners and the old man Fletcher and the schoolteacher who was still in transit and Aaron, who had declined an invitation to spend Christmas with a family he knew in the next town in favor of being here. After dinner, when the other boarders had retired, Clara and Aaron sat together on the front porch in their coats, looking out at the cold Christmas night and the few lights of Redemption Creek. I have been thinking about spring, Clara said. Tell me, he said. I think spring is when I would want to go, leave here, start somewhere else. She looked at the lanterns. Fredericksburg maybe, like we talked about. I want to look into teaching positions there. I have been writing letters. You have been writing letters, he said, and the pleasure in his voice was unmistakable. I wrote to the county school board, she said, 2 weeks ago. I have not had a reply yet, but I should hear something by January. He took her hand. She let him. Fredericksburg it is, he said. I will start making inquiries about land nearby. Something small to start, enough for a kitchen garden and a few animals. I will build up from there. She looked at him. You are very certain about Fredericksburg now. 2 months ago we had not even mentioned it. 2 months ago I was working on convincing you to have a conversation with me, he said. I was not in a position to plan anything. Now I am. She laughed softly and leaned her head against his shoulder, which was the first time she had done that, and he adjusted slightly to accommodate her more comfortably. And they sat like that in the Christmas cold, watching the town be small and quiet and impermanent around them. And Clara thought about the spring with a feeling that was not fear, but something almost like joy. January brought a reply from the Fredericksburg County School Board. The letter said that there was a position available beginning in September, that the current teacher was moving on, and that Clara's qualifications, as she had described them in her letter, would make her a suitable candidate pending a more formal evaluation. It was not a firm offer, but it was an open door, and Clara read it 3 times and then went to find Aaron, who was in the stable giving Bishop his morning grain. She handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it and looked up at her, and the look on his face was so unguarded and glad that she felt her heart do something large and involuntary. September, he said. September, she confirmed. That gives us the spring to get there and the summer to settle in, he said. I can have land identified and a structure up by summer if we move quickly. She looked at him. You are going to build another house. I am going to build the right house, he said, and she understood that he meant the one he had always been building toward. She stepped forward and kissed him, which she was doing more often now with the ease of something established and right, and he kissed her back with both hands on her face and flour on her collar from the morning baking, and Bishop watched them from his stall with the philosophical equanimity of a very old horse. February in Redemption Creek was the hardest month, with a cold, wet streak that kept everyone inside and made the days feel very long. Clara used the time to write more letters, to banks in Fredericksburg, to the county land office there, to a woman named Elena Vasquez, whose name had been given to her by Mrs. Dawson as someone who might help her find lodging when they first arrived. She organized and she planned, and she felt herself rebuilding something that she had taken apart and scattered a long time ago, which was her faith in the future. Aaron went back to Abilene briefly in February to sort out his land and animals there. He sold the property to a young couple who had been looking for a place, and he did it without regret, which surprised him slightly. He had built that house and he had been proud of it, but standing in the yard of it without Clara, he could see that it had always been the beginning of something rather than the thing itself, and he was ready for the thing itself. He came back to Redemption Creek with the proceeds of the sale and Bishop and his dogs, a pair of blue heelers named Dust and Current who had been with him for 3 years and were deeply unimpressed by their first sight of Redemption Creek, but adjusted quickly, as good dogs do. Clara met him at the stable when he rode back in, appearing in the door of the building with her shawl wrapped around her and her hair loose for once and her face open and glad. He got off Bishop and she walked to him and he put his arms around her right there in the stable door with the cold February light behind her, and they held each other for a long time without saying anything. "I missed you," she said against his coat. "Good," he said into her hair. "I missed you more. You do not know that." "I absolutely know that," he said. "I left. Missing someone is worse when you are the one who left." She pulled back and looked at him. "How was Abilene?" "Strange, smaller than I remembered. Like going back to a house you lived in as a child and finding that the rooms were the wrong size." She understood this completely. "Did you see anyone we knew?" "A few people. I told Mrs. Henderson you were well. She asked after you." Clara's expression went briefly complicated. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were very well and very happy and that I was on my way back to you." He looked at her. "And then she said she was glad because you deserved someone who looked at you the way I look at you, and I liked her very much for saying it." Clara pressed her lips together. "She always did see too much," she said, "but it was fond." March came with the first warmth, and Aaron made a trip to Fredericksburg to put down earnest money on a piece of land he had been in correspondence about, 40 acres on a creek with good water, and soil that a neighbor described as willing, which Aaron took to mean it responded well to effort. The land had an existing structure, a one-room stone building that had been a storage house, which would do as temporary lodging while he built. He came back with the papers signed and described the land to Clara over dinner, and she listened with her elbows on the table and her chin in her hands, her eyes going bright at certain details. The creek, the particular quality of light on the hills. "When can we leave?" she said. "When are you ready?" She thought about it. 2 weeks, she said. "I need to give Mrs. Dawson proper notice and time to find someone to replace me. She has been good to me. I want to leave properly." 2 weeks it is, he said. There were, in those 2 weeks, certain conversations that had been hovering and needed to be had. He had them with her on the bench behind the garden one evening, with the first warm air of the year coming through, and the dead garden beginning to show the first faint green suggestion of what it might be again. He did not get down on one knee because the ground was still damp. He sat beside her on the bench and took her hand and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that you can take as much time as you need with the answer and there is no wrong answer." She looked at him very steadily. "I would like to marry you," he said. "Not because it is the practical thing when 2 people travel together and settle in a new town, though it is that too, but because I want to. Because I have wanted to for a long time and I am tired of the hypothetical and ready for the actual." She was quiet for a moment that he did not fill. "When you say no wrong answer," she said carefully. "I mean it," he said. "If you say you want more time, I will give you more time. If you say you want to wait until we are in Fredericksburg and have settled, I will wait. If you say no entirely, I will be heartsick, but I will respect it." She looked at their joined hands. "I'm afraid," she said. "I know. Of what specifically? Of being bound again, of losing the person I am becoming." "Clara," he said, with a gentleness that was very specific, "do you think I am the kind of man who wants to bind you? Have I ever tried to make you smaller?" She thought about this honestly, the way she thought about all important things. "No," she said, "you have not. You have only ever tried to make me larger." "Then hear me when I say that what I am asking for is a partnership," he said, "between 2 people who are better together than apart, Nothing that takes from you, everything that adds. The warm spring air moved through the beginning of the garden. Somewhere in the growing things, that same cricket or another one very like it was singing. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding that breath for longer than just this evening. Then he raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles and said very quietly, "Thank you." "Do not thank me," she said, with a warmth that was almost teasing. "I am the lucky one." "We are both the lucky one," he said. Simultaneously. She laughed, and the laugh rose into the warm evening air and dissipated like something finally set free. They told Mrs. Dawson, who was visibly pleased, and who said she had known it from the moment she had looked at him standing on her porch asking after Clara. They told old Fletcher, who raised his coffee cup in salute and said nothing further because he was a man of very few words, but the salute said enough. The wedding they decided to hold before leaving Redemption Creek, small and simple, the way both of them preferred. The Reverend Thomas Campbell of the Redemption Creek Methodist Church was a spare, plain-spoken man who married them on a Sunday afternoon in the small church, with the morning light coming through the single clear window, and touching everything in the interior with the particular luminous quality of light that comes through clear glass into a quiet space. Mrs. Dawson was there, and Fletcher, and the current boarders, and a handful of townspeople who had come to know Aaron in the months since his arrival and who stood at the back of the church with the slightly gruff warmth that Western communities extended to events they approved of. Clara wore her best dress, which was blue calico, and she had let her hair down loose and pinned back with a small spray of the first spring flowers that were beginning to show along the creek bed. She walked to the front of the church on her own feet, and she stood beside Aaron, who had cleaned up very well indeed, and was wearing a coat she had not seen before that she suspected he had made somewhere, and she looked at him standing there waiting for her, and thought that there was no one in the world she would rather be walking toward. The ceremony was brief and plain and exactly right. When the Reverend asked if she took this man, she said she did with a directness that made the Reverend smile. When Aaron said the same, his voice was steady, but his hand on hers was slightly tighter than usual, which she noted and loved. They left Redemption Creek on a Tuesday morning in late April, with a wagon loaded with everything they owned between them, which was not excessive, and Bishop tied to the back, and the two blue heelers running alongside with the enthusiasm of dogs who have been told they are going somewhere new. Mrs. Dawson stood on her porch and watched them go and lifted her hand once, and Clara lifted hers back. And then the wagon turned south on the road, and the boarding house disappeared behind a rise, and Redemption Creek became a memory. The road to Fredericksburg took them through country that changed gradually as they moved south and west, the flat scrubby open of the north giving way to something hillier and more wooded, cedar and live oak on limestone ridges, the ground a deeper red, the sky feeling slightly lower and more intimate. Clara sat beside Aaron on the wagon seat and watched the country change and felt something very fundamental changing with it, the way a landscape can track an interior state. They stopped at a town called Mason on the second night and slept at a decent inn, and the innkeeper's wife gave them a knowing look at breakfast that Clara met with a serenity that still surprised her when she felt it. She was a married woman. She was on her way somewhere with her husband. She was, in every practical and emotional sense, starting over, and the starting over felt like beginning rather than repair. Aaron watched her across the breakfast table of the Mason Inn with a careful covert attention that she caught once and called him on. "You keep watching me," she said. "Yes," he said, unabashed. "Why?" "Because I like to look at you," he said, as if this were the most obvious thing in the world. "And because you look different today than you did yesterday, and I am trying to understand the difference." She considered. "What is different?" "You look at ease," he said. "You look like you are somewhere you belong." She thought about this. The inn was warm and the coffee was good, and through the window the Texas Hill country morning was bright and clear and wide open. "I think I am," she said. They arrived in Fredericksburg on the fourth day of travel, rolling in on the main street, which was the Hauptstrasse, the German word that was still in common use here from the settlement's founding 30 years before. The town was unlike anything Clara had quite expected, its architecture carrying that European influence in the stone buildings and the particular neatness of the laid-out streets, and yet entirely Texan in the light and the air and the scrub cedar hills pressing up against the edges. It was larger than Redemption Creek and livelier, and it had about it the feeling of a place that was actually going to last. They found their way to the land Elena Vasquez had written about, a room available above a dry goods store on the east end of the main street, clean and decent, which would do until the stone building on their property was made habitable. Elena Vasquez turned out to be a short, bright-eyed woman of about 40 whose family had been in the Fredericksburg area since nearly the beginning, and who took to Clara immediately with the warm directness of a woman who had no time for social performance. "You are the one who wrote about teaching," Elena said. "Yes," Clara said. "Good, we need someone who actually wants to be here. The last teacher left in November and we have been managing with who we have, and who we have is not enough." She looked at Aaron. "And you are building on the Morrison Creek land." "I am," Aaron said. "My cousin knows that land. Good soil, he says. You will need to dig your well in the northeast corner to hit the reliable water." She said this the way she said everything, as unvarnished fact. Aaron nodded and made a mental note. Their first weeks in Fredericksburg were the busiest of Clara's life. Aaron rode out to the land every day and began the enormous practical work of making it livable, clearing, digging, planning the house that would come in stages through the summer, starting with the stone building's conversion and moving from there. Clara spent her days exploring the town, introducing herself carefully and honestly, which was a form of courage she had not known she had, being a person with a name and a history in a new place rather than a person with no name and no history. She told Mrs. Elena Vasquez something of her past, not everything but the shape of it, a first marriage that had ended in difficult circumstances, a time of difficulty after. Elena listened without interrupting and then said, "That is not unusual in women who end up here. The hills attract people who need to start over. It is not a weakness, it is a practical response to a hard situation." Clara felt, in the reception of those words, something else releasing, another layer of the weight she had been carrying. The school board evaluation took place in June, a morning in the school building with 2 members of the board asking her questions about mathematics and reading and history. And Clara answered every question with the composed confidence of a woman who had been preparing for something her whole life. She was offered the position at the end of the evaluation, beginning in September as promised. She came home to the land, where Aaron was laying the foundation stones of the new house, and she stood at the edge of the cleared site and called out that she had the position, and he set down the stone he was carrying and came to her and lifted her off the ground entirely, which was not the reserved behavior she had come to expect from him and was therefore even better, and she laughed into his shoulder and held on. "September," she said when he set her down. "September," he confirmed, and kissed her there in the middle of the building site with the hill country summer going full and gold around them. The house went up through the summer. It was not large, but it was carefully built, 2 rooms to start with the clear intention of more to come, good cedar timber and local stone, and a kitchen fireplace that Aaron spent an entire week getting right because Clara spent most of her time in the kitchen, and it mattered that it was right. He was a man who built things to last, and he built this one with the particular care of someone building not just a house, but the thing a house was supposed to contain. Clara painted the front door blue, the specific blue of a certain quality of Texas morning sky. She did not know why this felt important, only that it did. Dust and Current had appointed themselves guardians of the property and patrolled the perimeter with great seriousness, occasionally acknowledging Bishop in the small paddock Aaron had fenced near the house with the professional courtesy of animals who had worked together for years. Elena Vasquez came out to see the house in August, walking through the 2 rooms with the evaluating eye of someone who had seen a great many houses built in these hills. "Good chimney," she said. "He spent a week on it," Clara said. "Smart," Alina said. She looked at Clara in the kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the window Aaron had placed carefully for exactly this quality of light. "You look like yourself," she said. "I did not know you before, but I can tell you look like yourself." Clara thought about this. "I feel like myself," she said. "For the first time in a long time, I feel entirely like myself." "That is what good land and good company does," Alina said practically, and went on examining the chimney. The school opened in September as planned, and Clara stood in front of 23 children ranging from age 6 to 14 in the stone school building on the west side of town, and felt something come together inside her that had been in pieces for a long time. She was good at it, which she had suspected but not been certain of, and the children responded to her in the way that children respond to teachers who actually want to be there, with a kind of trust that was both humbling and energizing. She came home in the evenings tired in the good way, the way that comes from using the right skills, and Aaron had supper on the table, and she would sit and tell him things that had happened during the day, and he would listen with his complete attention, which was one of his gifts, that specific quality of attention. In October, a year after he had ridden into Redemption Creek on Bishop's back with a letter in his pocket and nothing in his hands but hope, Aaron sat on the front step of their house in the October evening watching the hill country dark come in, and Clara came and sat beside him with 2 cups of coffee, the way they did most evenings. "It is a year," he said. "Almost exactly," she said. "Are you glad?" he said. She looked at him. The October evening was cool and smelled of cedar and the distant suggestion of winter, and the door behind them was the particular blue of a Texas morning. "I'm more than glad," she said. "I am Aaron. I'm the happiest I have ever been, and I say that knowing it is a large thing to say." He took her cup from her and set both cups down and took her face in his hands and looked at her. "I want you to know something," he said. "Tell me." "When I rode to Redemption Creek, I did not know if you would have me. I knew I was going to try, but I did not know how it would come out. And I want you to know that this, right here, is better than anything I had imagined it might be." He paused. "You are better. You are always better than what I imagine." She leaned forward and kissed him softly and then rested her forehead against his. The hill country dark settled around them, and the dogs came and sat at their feet with the devoted practicality of dogs who considered their people entirely their responsibility. And somewhere on the creek, the water ran over the limestone the way it had always run, with no regard for the years of human joy and struggle on its banks. "I have something to tell you," Clara said after a while. He drew back to look at her, something in her voice. "I believe we may be having a child," she said. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man receiving information that is larger than his immediate capacity to speak. "Clara," he said. "I am not entirely certain yet," she said, "but I think he kissed her. It was the kind of kiss that said things that words were not large enough to say." "When?" he said. "Spring, I think," she said, "if I am right about the timing." He put his arms around her and held her, and she could feel his heart beating fast. "I need to build another room," he said against her hair. She laughed. "You just finished these ones." "I will start planning in the morning," he said. "Aaron." "The south side has the best light," he said. "It is logical." She pulled back and looked at his face, which was doing that thing where it was entirely open, all the careful containment gone, and she saw in it everything she had been afraid to hope for since she was a young woman sitting in a one-room schoolhouse looking across a desk at a boy who was annoyed with her for knowing the answers. She saw joy, pure and unguarded and real. She put her hand on his face, that jaw that had not seen a razor in several days again, that familiar face. "You are going to be wonderful," she said. "I am going to be terrified," he said. "You can be both," she said. "In my experience, the best people are." Spring came to Fredericksburg the way it always did in those hills, in a rush of bluebonnets and the green explosion of cedar and live oak. And Clara's son was born on a morning in late April when the creek was running high, and the air smelled of rain and growing things. He came into the world in their house with Elena Vasquez there, and a capable local woman named Mrs. Braun, who had brought more babies into the world in Gillespie County than anyone could count. Aaron was in the house, which was not always the practice, but Aaron was not a man who could be convinced to be elsewhere when Clara needed him, and Mrs. Braun had given him a look, and Elena had simply said, "Let him stay," and he had stayed. He held Clara's hand through the worst of it with the specific steadiness of a man who had decided that being present was the only thing he could offer, and offering it completely was what he was going to do. The boy was born healthy and loud, with a full head of dark hair and eyes that were still that unfocused newborn blue, but that Clara already suspected would go darker. And he weighed him out by feel, and said he felt like a good solid 7 pounds, which Mrs. Braun confirmed by her own assessment as about right. Aaron held his son with a careful practiced competence that surprised her until she remembered that he had grown up on a working ranch and had a great deal of experience with young things, and the expression on his face as he looked down at the child was something she was going to keep in her memory for the rest of her life. "What do we call him?" he said. They had discussed names but had not settled. "I have been thinking," Clara said from where she lay propped against the pillows. "What do you think of James?" "James," Aaron said, considering. "After my father," she said, "if you do not mind." He looked at her. "James Carver," he said. "I think that is a fine name." The boy made a sound that they chose to interpret as agreement. Elena Vasquez stayed for an hour and then went home with the particular satisfied air of someone who had witnessed something good. Mrs. Braun checked everything that needed checking and declared both mother and child in excellent condition, and left with the efficiency of a woman who had other work to do. And Aaron sat in the chair he had moved beside the bed and held James Carver while Clara slept, and he looked at his son's face in the spring morning light, and felt the particular enormous quiet of a life that had found its shape. James grew with the enthusiasm of a healthy child in good country. He crawled at 6 months and was walking by 11 months, and was talking in 2-word sentences by his first birthday, which Clara noted with the slightly competitive pleasure of a schoolteacher who could not help but track these milestones. He was an agreeable child, curious and sturdy, with Clara's eyes and Aaron's jaw, and he took to Bishop with the fearlessness of small children who have not yet learned to assess risk, which caused Aaron a few heart-stopping moments, but also filled him with a particular quiet pride. Clara taught school through that first year and then through the second. The school grew. She hired a second teacher to help with the older students, and organized a small library for the school building, using a combination of donations from the community and purchases made from the school board budget. Fredericksburg was the kind of town that valued education with the particular seriousness of a community that had built itself through collective effort. And Clara fit into it the way water fits into its proper channel, completely and naturally, and as if it had always been where it belonged. Aaron had 40 acres, and then 60 when the adjacent parcel came available, and the owner was willing to sell. He ran cattle, not the large operations that the big ranchers ran, but enough, managed with the focused attention of a man who cared about doing things right rather than doing them fast. He also did something that surprised people who knew him only as a rancher, which was that he was good with horses in a specific and teachable way, and he began to take on horses that other people had given up on, the difficult animals, the ones that had been mishandled or frightened into bad behavior, and he worked with them with a patience that was essentially the same patience he had brought to Clara's door in Redemption Creek, and the results were the same. People noticed. People brought him horses from further away. He was not a horse trainer in any formal sense, but the word got around the way words get around in the hill country. One evening when James was about 2 years old and had been put to bed after the specific exhausting theater of a 2-year-old's bedtime, Clara and Aaron sat on the front step with their evening coffee, which was their custom, and she told him that she was expecting again. He received this news with the same expression he had received the first time, which was the expression of a man whose capacity for gratitude exceeded his capacity for language. "Another spring baby," he said. "If the timing is right," she said. "Late March, I think. I need to add to the second room," he said. "Aaron, James is still in our room. He will want his own room eventually. He is too. Planning ahead," he said serenely. She looked at him with an exasperated love that was entirely comfortable with itself, that had none of the terror or the qualification of the early days but had instead the warmth of something well established and still growing. "You are a very good man, Aaron Carver," she said. "I have a very good reason," he said. The second child was a girl, born in late March on a day of alternating rain and sun, the kind of day that could not decide what it wanted to be. They named her Rose, because Clara had put rose bushes along the south wall of the house that previous spring and they had bloomed extraordinary that summer, and because it was a small, beautiful, practical name for what they hoped would be a small, beautiful, practical person. Rose was from the beginning the kind of child who made herself clearly known, louder than James had been, and with a specific determination about her wants that made itself apparent very early. Aaron held her in the lamplight the night she was born, and said she had his mother's nose, and Clara said she had Clara's grandmother's stubbornness. And Aaron said those two things together suggested a formidable combination, and Clara said that was entirely the point. James, at 2.5, observed his sister with the careful philosophical attention of a small child encountering something entirely new, and concluded within a week that she was acceptable, which was the most that could be hoped for. The years in Fredericksburg moved in the way that good years move, with the specific quality of time that feels both quick and sufficient. The house grew with the family. The south room Aaron had been planning since before James was born, and then a sleeping loft, and then a proper kitchen separate from the main room because Clara had always thought that the kitchen deserved its own space, and Aaron agreed because the kitchen was where she was most herself, and she deserved the best version of it. Elena Vasquez became one of the fixed points of their life, appearing regularly for meals, and for the kind of conversation that people have when they have established a real friendship, honest and interested and unimpressed by performance. She watched James and Rose when Clara and Aaron needed time alone, which she dispensed as a practical necessity rather than a favor, and she taught Clara to make tamales, which took 3 attempts and tasted better each time. Mrs. Dawson came to visit in the summer of 1882. She had sold the Redemption Creek boarding house to a nephew and was traveling and had written to say she would like to see how things had turned out. Clara met her at the stage and walked her back through town to the house, and watched Mrs. Dawson's face as she took in the blue door and the rose bushes and the sound of children inside and the general lived-in rightness of the place. "Well, Mrs. Dawson said," which was the same word she had said when Claude Hicks's threat had been neutralized, and it carried the same weight. They sat on the front step in the evening with their coffee, and James came and climbed onto Aaron's knee with the complete confidence of a child who has never been given a reason not to trust, and Rose staggered about in the grass with the unsteady determination of a child who has recently discovered walking and considers it the best invention in the history of the world. "You found a good one," Mrs. Dawson said to Clara, not quietly because subtlety had never been her preference. "He found me," Clara said, rather persistently. "The good ones do, Mrs. Dawson said. Aaron, who had heard all of this, said nothing, but his expression was the particular expression of a man who is deeply, quietly satisfied. They had been in Fredericksburg 4 years when Clara saw the school board elections produce, for the first time, a woman board member, a Mrs. Adler whose family had farmed the hills south of town for 20 years. Clara attended the board meeting where she was seated and felt something important in that room, the sense of something being different that should have been different for a long time. She thought about the injustice of it, of how many capable women had been in rooms adjacent to the decisions that governed their lives without any voice in those decisions, and she thought about how her own teaching was one small part of changing that, one generation at a time. She came home and told Aaron about the meeting, and he listened and said, "Good." It was past time, and she loved him for the plainness of that response, the lack of qualification. The 5th year in Fredericksburg brought a third child, a boy they named Thomas, who arrived in November on a cool, clear night and was, Aaron noted, the most serene of their 3 children, studying his new world with a patience that Aaron recognized. "He has your eyes," Clara said. "He is looking at everything," Aaron said, "like he is memorizing it." "Like his father," Clara said. James was 5 by then and very interested in Thomas in a specifically supervisory way, positioning himself as a source of important knowledge about what the world was like and what was in it. Rose at 3 had no particular interest in being supervised by James and communicated this at some volume. Thomas observed all of it with his New World serenity. The house held them all. Bishop, at 16, began to slow in the way that old horses slow, not suddenly but in the gradual way of something that has given everything it had and is earning the right to rest. Aaron adjusted his work accordingly, putting the younger horses to the heavier tasks and leaving Bishop to lighter work and long afternoons in the paddock in the sun. Clara sometimes brought her coffee out and sat on the fence while Bishop stood near her, and the children fed him grass through the rails, and she thought about all the miles that horse had made and what they had brought him to, and by extension what they had brought all of them to. One morning in the spring of 1883, Aaron saddled Bishop for a short, easy ride along the creek, just the 2 of them, the way they had been just the 2 of them for a long time. He rode along the water in the early morning light with the bluebonnets going on either side and the creek running clear and cold over the limestone, and Bishop walked with the dignified ease of a horse who knew every inch of this land and belonged to it. When they came back, Clara was in the garden with Rose and Thomas, and James was on the fence watching with the serious air of a 5-year-old who considers himself a judge of horsemanship. Aaron dismounted and led Bishop to the paddock and uncinched the saddle and rubbed him down with the careful thoroughness of a man who is also saying something without words. Clara came to the paddock fence and looked at him. "Good ride," she said. "Perfect," he said. She looked at Bishop, who was standing in the spring sun with his eyes half closed. "He is happy here," she said. "He is," Aaron said. "We all are." She leaned her arms on the paddock rail and watched the horse and the hills and the children in the garden. James was explaining something to Thomas with great authority. Thomas was listening with that patient newborn attention translated into a 7-month-old's focus. Rose had abandoned both of them to pursue a butterfly across the yard with single-minded intensity. "Aaron," Clara said, "yes, I have been thinking about something. Tell me. I think I would like to go back to Redemption Creek someday, not to stay. Just to see it." She paused. "To know that I can go back to a place I ran from and look at it and not feel afraid." He came and stood beside her at the fence rail. "Whenever you want to go," he said. "Not yet," she said, "but sometime." "Whenever you are ready," he said. "We can take the whole family." She looked at him. "You would bring the children to Redemption Creek." "I would go anywhere with you and our children," he said. "That is what it means." She put her arm through his, and they stood together looking at the paddock and the hills and the sky over Fredericksburg in the spring of 1883. And everything that had happened and everything that would happen was contained in that moment. The long ride he had made and the bench behind the dead garden, and the letter that had arrived smelling of dust, and the blue door, and the school, and the children, and the Creekwater October eyes that had seen her from the beginning. "I love you," she said, in the direct, unhesitating way she had learned to say it over the years. "I know you do," he said, "and I love you. And I am going to be saying that to you every day for the rest of my life, so you might as well get comfortable with it." "I have been comfortable with it for years," she said. "Good," he said, "because I am not stopping." She laughed, and the laugh went out into the spring air of the Texas hill country. And the bluebonnets were going, and the creek was running, and the children were alive in the yard. and the house behind them with its blue door was full of everything a house was supposed to be full of, and the life that had seemed impossible from a boarding house room above a laundry in a town called Redemption Creek was entirely, completely, irreversibly real. Thomas turned one in November and took his first steps across the kitchen floor toward Clara's outstretched hands, and Aaron watched from the doorway with his coffee going cold, and felt the particular uncomplicated happiness of a man who knows he is exactly where he is supposed to be. James started school the following September, in the same school where Clara taught, which produced both the pleasure of having her boy in her classroom for the first month before he moved up and the challenge of maintaining professional composure when James answered a question incorrectly, and looked at her with an expression that was so specifically Aaron that she almost lost her composure entirely for a different reason. Rose, at 4, informed everyone who would listen that she intended to have horses of her own when she was grown, which Aaron took entirely seriously and began to act on by teaching her, with enormous patience and care, the basics of horsemanship from the ground up, just as he had promised Clara years before on a bench behind a dying garden. Clara did go back to Redemption Creek in the fall of 1884. She went with Aaron and James, who was 7, and Rose, who was 5, and Thomas, who was almost 2, and they came into the town on a clear October afternoon, and the main street was the same in all its small ways and different in others. The Rand Imperial Hotel's sign had been repaired, so it said the full name again, and the Dawson boarding house had new curtains. Mrs. Dawson was in San Antonio with her nephew. The bench behind the garden was still there, a little more weathered, and Clara sat on it in the October afternoon and looked at the dead garden, which was dead again as it had been when she first saw it, late in the season, and felt nothing except the quiet, clear knowledge of what she had been here and what she was now. Aaron sat beside her on the bench as he had the first time, and the children were inside with the new proprietor of the boarding house, who was a practical woman very like Mrs. Dawson, and the same fiddle music was coming from the saloon 2 streets over, and for a moment the years folded in on themselves the way time sometimes did, and she was sitting there in her gray dress with everything undecided. And then a door banged inside and she could hear James telling Thomas not to touch something in his serious older brother voice, and she came entirely back to now. "You all right?" Aaron said. "Better than all right," she said. "I came back and it is just a town. It is just a place I was once. It is where I found you," he said. "It is where you refused to leave without my answer," she said, "and you gave it. Eventually," she said. He put his arm around her on the bench behind the garden, and she leaned into his side, and the October afternoon light fell across the dead garden, and the first cold of the year moved through the air between the buildings. And it was the same and entirely different, and that difference was the whole story. They rode home to Fredericksburg on the same road they had traveled to get there, and the hill country came up around them again in all its October beauty, the cedar going that deep winter green and the sky the color of old pewter, and Clara drove the wagon the last stretch because she wanted to. She had learned properly since coming here. And Aaron sat beside her with Thomas asleep against his side, and James pointing out landmarks to Rose with the authority of a 7-year-old who has been here before and considers himself a guide, and Bishop walked at the back with the measured stride of an old horse who had been many places and knew how to come home. They could see the blue door from the road as they came up to the house, catching the last of the afternoon light, and Clara felt the particular warmth of it, that specific blue, that specific door, the place she had chosen and built, and the life she had made inside it. She stopped the wagon in the yard, and Aaron lifted the sleeping Thomas, and James jumped down, and Rose was already running for the paddock to check on her horse, the small, gentle mare that Aaron had found for her, and that Rose had named Buttercup with complete confidence in the rightness of the name. Clara stepped down from the wagon and stood in the yard of her house in the October evening and looked at all of it, the blue door and the rose bushes going dormant for winter, and the children and the dogs and the horses and the hills, and Aaron came and stood beside her. "Home," he said. "Home," she confirmed. He put his hand at the small of her back, and they walked to the blue door together and went inside. And the evening came down over the hill country in all its quiet colors, and the creek ran on in the dark the way it had always run, with no knowledge of the years and no care for anything but its own patient continuation. And in the house with the blue door the lamps came on one by one in the windows as the dark came in, until the house was lit from inside against the evening. Warm and solid and entirely full of everything it was supposed to be full of, which is to say, of life.